This story is called The North Wind and the Sun. A dispute arose between the north wind and the sun, each claiming that he was stronger than the other. At last, they agreed to try their powers upon a traveler to see which could soonest strip him of his cloak. So the north wind took the first try. Gathering up all his force for the attack, he came whirling furiously down upon the man, and he caught up his cloak as though he would wrest it from him by one single effort. But the harder the wind blew, the more closely the man wrapped it around himself. Then came the turn of the sun. At first, he beamed gently upon the traveler, who soon unclasped his cloak and walked on with it hanging loosely about his shoulders. Then the sun shone forth in his full strength, and the man, before he had gone many more steps, was glad to throw his cloak right off and complete his journey more lightly clad. The moral of that story is pretty simple. Persuasion is better than force. I would say it's more than that, though. It's not just persuasion. It's the power of gentleness over coercion and control. As we approach Christmas, and this will be my sort of Christmas sermon for this week, I think about Jesus' first advent, his coming into the world as a baby in a manger. That's what we're supposed to think about at Christmas. But we can't help but think that there was another main character when Jesus entered the world as the King of the Jews. If you're not aware, there was already a king of the Jews, an Idumean man named Herod the Great, who was seated on the throne. And the story of Christmas is also a story of two kings vying for leadership, and more exactly, two styles of leadership. One, I would argue, is the north wind, coercion and control and force, Herod. The other, which is namely Jesus, gentle compassion, love, and concern. I want to follow that thread through the story. I want to think about how that connects us to Christmas and how it should lead us to think about kingship and leadership and the power of love in our world. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We see in Matthew chapter 2, the Magi. They're not named. They're not three kings of Orient. You could sing that, I don't care, but it's not historically founded. They were students of ancient scholarship, of philosophy, and studied the scrolls that were kept in libraries in the Eastern world. And they traveled because of a prophecy that they had read concerning a new king that would rise over the Jewish people in Israel. They were intrigued by this. So they came to the current king, Herod, and they said, "Where is this child to be born? We want to find him. We want to see him." And as you might imagine, you don't ask the king where the new king is being born. That's going to upset the current king. And so Herod was upset. He was angered by this. And since there's already a king, he's scared that he's going to lose grip. He's going to lose power and control over the people. Because Herod's entire rule is built on power and control. It's built on fear. Herod responds to these magi the way that any insecure world leader would respond. Violence, outrage, quick-tempered, insecure. He, if you don't know the story, chooses to massacre all the children 2 and under, all the little boys 2 and under in the village of Bethlehem, just to make sure that there's no threat to his throne. Herod's willingness, it's not really a happy start to a Christmas sermon. Here, I didn't realize that as I wrote it, but it'll get better. Herod's willingness to slaughter defenseless babies to secure his own power is the ultimate picture of worldly leadership. Think about that. Self-serving, oppressive, ruthless. That is leadership in this world. The people we think of as the great leaders are often oppressive, ruthless, and self-serving. And somehow they get ahead by doing that. In contrast, we have Jesus, the true king, who willingly becomes a defenseless baby. I want you to think about that for a second. This is profound. Think about this. Herod, a king, kills babies to protect his power. Jesus, the king of the universe, becomes a baby and gives his power away. Just think about that. A king who is willing to kill babies to protect his power, and a king who would become a defenseless baby and give up his power. Which of those kings would you want to serve? It's kind of a no-brainer from the very beginning. Where Herod grasps for control, Jesus willingly lets go of it. Where Herod clings to his throne, Jesus leaves his throne behind to go and serve the least of these in his kingdom. Herod's fear reflects the kind of kingship that we're too familiar with in this world. And if you can't tell, I'm not just talking about kings. We're talking about any kind of earthly leaders. Those who rule with domination and force. Caesar operated the same way. We've probably heard of Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, which is a myth. There was no peace in Rome. It's not really peace when you have armed soldiers on every corner keeping the peace by the sword. That's feigning peace. That's not real peace. It's not what we're hoping for from a leader. Earthly kings rule with a fear of mentality. We're going to talk about fear of and fear for today. I'll talk about those words a lot. Fear of versus fear for. But the fear of is fear of punishment, fear of force, fear of imprisonment, fear of death or execution. That's how earthly leaders rule. They make you afraid. Jesus, though, is a different kind of king. He doesn't rule through fear of domination or force or destruction. His kingdom is one of love and justice. We read about it in Isaiah 9 at this time of year. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, to establish it, to uphold it with justice and righteousness. Jesus wins our hearts not through force, but through compassion. He lifts up the lowly. He heals the broken. The prophet said he would come and be the kind of ruler who wouldn't bruise even a bent reed, which is an ancient way of saying if someone is down, he's not going to make it worse. He's going to help them. He sees our needs, and he wants to help. He brings justice to the oppressed. He's not the oppressor. He's the one who sets them free. Herod and Jesus then represent us with a choice. Every Christmas season, when we think about the two kinds of kings, we're forced to consider, do we cling to control and power and self-preservation like Herod, or do we live like Jesus and offer ourselves for the good of others? I would like you to think about your own relationships in your life. Ask yourself, am I trying to manipulate or dominate or make myself look better? Or am I seeking to serve and love and lift others up? I really want you to think about that. In your relationships, are you the person who's trying to control and by force make things the way you think they ought to be? And at times even make sure you look good in the situation? Or are you the kind of person in your relationships who just gives of yourself in love for the other? I'd like to consider the Old Testament for a moment. The story of Rehoboam. Rehoboam in 1 Kings 12 is the son of Solomon. And after his father's death, he takes the throne over the kingdom of Israel. And for just a moment, it's the final united kingdom that we have in Scripture, because Rehoboam's going to make a pretty foolish mistake. The people come to him during this period of civil unrest, and they go to the new king, Rehoboam, and they say, listen, your dad was hard. He was rough on us. Toward the end of his life, he had us doing all these building projects. And if you don't know, Solomon was responsible for building the great temple and the temple of Jerusalem. That was an amazing feat, okay? That was Solomon's project, and he built other things too, and he was known to have been a very accomplished king. But as you might know, kings who accomplish a lot have to use their underlings to accomplish all that work. And so Solomon was a pretty hard taskmaster as a king. The people then gripe to Rehoboam, and they say, listen, your dad, toward the end of his life, he was so hard on us, and he put us to work every day, and we just need a break. What are you going to be like? And so Rehoboam talks to his advisors. He first goes to his father's advisors, the older men, and he says, what do you think I should say? And his father's advisors say in 12 verse 7, if you will be a servant to this people today and you serve them, then they will be your servants forever. Well, that sounds like good advice. If you will give in to their request, give them a rest, a break, be kind to them, be a servant to them as a king, then they will turn around and they will be faithful to you as their king. They will serve you. Okay? But then Rehoboam ignores their advice. He talks to his young friends, advisors that are his age. And they tell him to rule harshly. They say, you know what you should tell him? If you think my dad was bad, wait till you see me. If you were scared of him, you'll be a lot more afraid of me. If you thought the whips were bad for punishment, I'm going to punish you with scorpions. Some dark stuff. I didn't make that up. That's what he said. It's heavy-handed, right? And if you don't know, the people turn against him right away, and the kingdom is divided. The 10 tribes in the north and the 2 tribes in the south. And next thing you know, we have 2 kingdoms instead of 1, and kings vying for power, and the rest of the history of Israel is almost laughable if it weren't so sad and dark. All of this because of someone who would not show compassion as a leader, someone who tried to rule through domination and force. Rehoboam's mistake was that he wouldn't choose gentleness. He didn't believe that to serve the people would work out better in the end. Contrast that with Jesus, who says in Matthew 11, when he looks at people who are tired and weary, and he says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for I am gentle and lowly in heart." Jesus offers rest, not more burden. He says he will help us carry it instead of adding more to it. That's a better kind of king. And that brings us to the theme of fear, because the reason we struggle with this as earthly people is that we function out of fear, we thrive on fear, we manipulate people with fear. That's why every other worship song on the radio talks about fear, because it's at the heart of our problem as humans, fear. Fear is a problem. Love, therefore, would be the opposite of fear. Many of us, when we think of fearing the Lord, how many of you have heard that phrase? You should fear the Lord. Okay, that's a biblical phrase. It's true. How many of you, when you hear that, you imagine something like trembling in terror? Probably. You know, waiting for lightning bolts from heaven to strike down. Waiting for God to show up with a cosmic fly swatter and squish you like a bug. That's, to be fair, how many of us were raised to think. Maybe it's how it's depicted in modern media or whatever. We think of God that way, that he's out to get us. He's trying to hurt us, maybe. Don't mess up or you're toast. I didn't make that one up. My father-in-law and I have sort of a running joke where when we see a really cheesy church sign, we'll snap a picture and text it to each other. And he's in Indiana and I'm here in Ohio, so we don't see the same ones. He sent me one quite a while ago. I don't remember what denomination it was. That doesn't matter. It was embarrassing, though. It said, "Receive the bread of heaven or else you're toast." That was my gut reaction, too. I was like, okay, that's pretty funny. That's pretty funny. And then I stewed on it for a minute, and then I got kind of angry, and I thought, this is a shame, because even though it is funny and clever, that really is the way people think of God. He's just waiting for you to mess up so he can destroy you, just snap his fingers and eradicate you, as if he never wanted you to exist at all, which is how I am with my kids whenever they mess up. I just can't wait to destroy them forever. That's sarcasm, because no good father thinks like that. Even when a good father disciplines, it's not because they want you to be toast, right? They love you. They want to help you if they're a decent father or mother. The idea of God as the perfect parent is that he has no intention of destroying you. All God wants to do is help you and heal you and encourage you and grow you into the person you're meant to be. And so when we speak of God that way, where we fear him with trembling, where we are scared of God, then we've already missed the point. That's not the kind of fear the Bible intends us to think about. So here's the thing. What the Bible does mean by fear of the Lord is fear for, not fear of. And this is where that play comes in. Fear of versus fear for. Okay? Fear of. Fear of something is rooted in dread, in terror. It's scary. It's gut-churning, white-knuckled expectation of punishment. It's what Herod used to control his kingdom in Judea. And it's a lesson that he lifted from Caesar, who's in charge of all of Rome. Fear keeps people in line. If they're afraid of you, then they will probably do what you say. Fear of making a mistake, because there's a ruler who's waiting to pounce on you if you slip up. That's fear of. But fear for is entirely different. Fear for is reverent, tender concern. It's love that says, I care so much about this relationship that I don't want to do anything to damage it. It's not about fearing punishment, it's about honoring the connection. It's not being afraid of the person, it's being afraid of wounding the person, being pulled away from the person. It's about loving the other so deeply that you are careful not to hurt them. That kind of fear for, that reverent concern shows up all over our relationships if they're healthy. So think about marriage. In a healthy marriage, fear doesn't look like walking on eggshells around your spouse. I have to get this right or else I'm going to have to deal with them for a day or two, right? Their bad attitude, whatever. You're afraid of their reaction. God forbid you're afraid if they're abusive at home. It's even worse. Instead, fear for looks like, I don't want to screw this up because I don't want to hurt my spouse because I love them. I don't want them to second guess things. I don't want them to be anxious around me. I don't want them to feel nervous. I don't want them to feel unloved or undesired. It's the spouse who stops and says, hey, I should watch my words here because I don't want to say anything I'll regret. I don't want to hurt this person. It's being thoughtful about your actions, not out of dread, but out of love. So fear for is what helps you fight fair with kindness, where you solve problems instead of blaming each other. Fear for looks like that text when you're going to be late and you don't want your spouse to worry, so you text them and say, hey, I'm running behind, but it'll be okay, I'll be there soon. Those little nods to say, I don't want you to worry, I don't want you to be afraid. That's fear for the person. You're concerned about them. It protects intimacy. It leaves you feeling committed to show up for each other every day because you're afraid that love could wane or grow cold if you don't keep pouring yourself into it. That's a healthy fear for the person, okay? That's not all, though. We see it in parenting. In fact, if we're going to talk about fear, parenting has to come up. Anyone who's a parent understands fear. We fear a lot of things for our children, with our children. We kind of want our kids to be afraid of us sometimes, and that's where I'm going with this. So I don't want my kids to be afraid of me. I try to explain this sometimes in sermons. I don't know if it ever comes across right. You probably all think I'm just a really abusive father. But I really don't. I don't want to hurt my kids. But I don't want my kids to hurt themselves either. And so somehow my job as a disciplinarian is to protect them by disciplining them, to teach them by correcting them. It's challenging. But sometimes I feel like my kids are afraid of me. And it is a devastating feeling to think that your child is afraid of you. Because all I really want them to fear is for me, to fear how their decisions will make me feel as a father, to worry about, this sounds bad too, but my opinion of them, that they would want to honor me and the name that they carry as my children. But most importantly, that they be good and healthy and happy people who know how to love others. That's what I want for them, because I fear for them. I'm not afraid of my kids, but I am very much afraid for them, because I want to protect them. I want to raise them well. I want them to understand that fear in reverse. I want them to understand how to fear for me as their father, not to be afraid of me. That looks like disciplining for the right reasons, not out of anger and outbursts, but thoughtfully with correction in mind to help them, to grow them. It looks like a kid telling their parent, maybe it's a teenager saying, I'm going to be home late tonight. I just want you to know where I am. I'm at so-and-so's house. I'm doing this. Everything's fine because I don't want you to worry. Not because if I show up late, I'm going to get in trouble, right? It's the kid who cleans up their stuff and puts it away and dusts their dresser because they know it will make their parents proud. Not because if they don't, they might lose TV for a week or something. It's doing things out of love, not out of fear of punishment. It's quite different. The kid might be doing the same action. That's what's hard about this, is you can't tell until you really sit and think about it. Am I doing these things because I'm intentional about loving this person, my parent or my child? Or am I doing these things because I'm afraid of this person? That's a tough question to answer. It requires us to be pretty honest with ourselves. It's also what allows us to have healthy friendships. If you've ever had a deep connection with another person, and I mean a platonic friendship connection with another person, a meaningful friendship, preferably a long-term friendship, then you know those relationships are not based on fear. Not fear of, anyway. You should not be afraid of your friend or how they will react. That's typically why we consider them good friends, because we're not afraid of them. We know we can be honest around that person. We can be truthful. We can be unambiguous. We can just lay it out there. And we trust that this person cares for me, and I don't have to be afraid of how they're going to react. That's where friendship grows, is in a space that's beyond fear of another. But eventually it leads to fear for. You worry for your friends. You care for them deeply. That's healthy. That's the right kind of fear. I just think we misunderstand this a lot. When you care about how you speak to them, how you respond to them, when you care enough to fear their well-being more than the awkwardness of telling them what they need to hear. If you think of a true friend will tell you what must be said. Fake friends don't do that. They don't want that drama. But true friends will tell you what you need to hear, even if it's hard, because they fear for you more than they are afraid of you and how you might react. You think about that. That's true friendship. We even see it in the workplace. Think about how jobs change or work environments can affect you if they're toxic and full of fear of being penalized by your employer all the time versus fear for, as in fear for your coworkers, that everybody performs well and that you keep numbers up and keep the money coming in and being productive and successful because you want everyone to succeed, because you care for them, because you care for the organization or the business. That's a different kind of fear. You fear for the success of your company and your friends. You're not afraid of being in trouble, right? That's so different. And this just affects every arena of life. We've already mentioned most of the big ones, right? Marriage and parenting and friendships and work. I mean, what else do you have? That's pretty much your life, right? It's everywhere, fear. What kind of fear do you function out of? That's the question. That's a question, although we don't think of it this way, that is a question that Christmas brings up over and over again, year after year. What kind of fear do we function out of? Fear for builds trust and integrity. Fear for makes healthy marriages and parenting and friendships and work relationships. And isn't that exactly what God wants from us? To fear for our connection with God, not to be afraid of punishment by God. I wonder if that's how you think of God. Do you think that he is waiting for you to be so afraid of him that you finally do what you're supposed to do? Or do you understand that God cares for you? And in case it's questionable in your mind, God uses a couple of analogies throughout the Bible and their marriage and parenting. It's these very things. And then Jesus adds friendship. He says, you're a friend that's closer than a brother. So he nails them, right? He says, a good, healthy marriage, that's God with his church, Christ and his church. Parenting, that's the Father in heaven and his children that he loves, the beloved ones. That's healthy. Jesus says to his friends, you used to be like servants, students, but now you are my friends, and I will be a friend that's better than a sibling. I will be so close with you. God's trying to tell you to shift the way you are afraid. Don't be afraid of, be afraid for. I hope that's making sense. I don't want to beat a dead horse. I shouldn't say that either. That sounds dark. I don't want to belabor the point. Let me get back to my notes. We need to reverence God. We need to be in awe of God, okay? What he's done for us, who he is. Who is God? That should bring us a fear, but not fear of him, fear for him, because he is so great and grandiose. But people don't know how to love rightly. We love out of fear and not fear for. And so our love is imperfect. And that brings me to my other favorite Bible verse. So last week I quoted James, my favorite verse. Now I'm going to quote my other favorite verse. I have two. 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. There is no fear in love. There is no fear in love. But perfect love drives out fear. Because fear has to do with punishment. Oh, see, I didn't come up with any of this. I just stole it from John. Fear has to do with punishment. Whoever fears has not been perfected in love. If you are still afraid of God, then you don't know God's love, not perfectly. That's the Bible. I'm not making this up. That's Scripture. If you are afraid of God, then you don't really know God, not rightly. Because the true love of God leads to a fear for, not a fear of. I'm going to think of another way to put this. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's Jewish, not Christian, but still wrote a beautiful translation of this term in the Hebrew. He says fear of the Lord, in the Hebrew phrase, should be translated radical amazement for the Lord. And I think that's even better. Radical amazement toward the Lord or toward God. It's not fear that pushes us away or makes us scared. It's a fear that draws us in closer. John Behr, who I think is one of the greatest theologians of our time, he puts it beautifully. He says, to fear God is to recognize the magnitude of his love and his grace and to stand in awe of the one who has stooped so low to lift us so high. That's fear of the Lord. It's the kind of fear Jesus embodies in his kingship. He doesn't demand loyalty through terror and threat. He inspires awe through love and compassion. So how do you approach God? Even at this Christmas season, are you driven by a fear of punishment, or are you in awe of God's love? You ever notice that Easter and Christmas, like the high holidays of the church, attendance kind of spikes? Actually, this season, attendance has been very good through the fall, so it hasn't been spiking as much. But a lot of times this week and next week, we'll see a lot of people here, and then I won't see you again for months. And that's okay. I still love you. And I've thought a lot more about that. And I often wonder, are people there to celebrate their spiritual heritage? Is it just a nostalgia, a sort of hearkening back to good glory days? Like, I want to be at church, I want to be with the family. It's just good and wholesome, and it's something we ought to do. Or, what I'm afraid is the case, is that some of you are here during holidays and significant moments in the seasons of life because you are afraid of what will happen if you skip. I can skip a normal Sunday, but what if I skip Easter? What if I skip Christmas? You know, the big guy's not going to like that very much. So I've got to show up at least for the big holidays. I need to make sure I appease God, that I check the list for the big stuff. Kind of like a not-so-great spouse who just shows up with flowers when they've made a big mistake, or does some romantic date night when they've really screwed up. But they don't do it normally. They're not interested in keeping the romance alive. It's just to save face. Or the kid who finally is polite and respectful because they know that they failed the test and got a D and they're about to get in big trouble, and they're like, I better do some nice stuff for mom and dad so I don't get in bigger trouble. There's no heart in that. That is self-preservation. That's not love. None of this is to guilt trip you about church attendance, although I hope it does. But that's not my intention. I do want to see you here. I think it's great. But I just worry that people are afraid of God and they misunderstand. And even if you're here every Sunday, but it's out of fear of God, then I want you to change your mindset. Come here and worship because you are afraid for your relationship with God, because you feel the need to stay connected to him, because he is so good and so loving, not because you're afraid he's going to pull out the hammer of justice upon your head or something, right? That's not the way we ought to think of God. He's not waiting to punish you. He's waiting to bless you. So be here. All right, I said more about that than I meant to say. God is the best kind of king. Psalm 103:19 says, the Lord has established his throne in the heavens. His kingdom rules over all. God isn't just the king here, he's the king everywhere. And he's the king for all time. His rule isn't like earthly kings who have temporal kingdoms in set times and places. God isn't that kind of king, and so he doesn't function the way that those kings function. He operates not out of human insecurity, but out of divine sovereignty. Sovereignty has, in my brain, become a bit of a dirty word theologically. I was formerly a 5-point Calvinist, and back then I was a real jerk. And I'm not saying you can't be a Calvinist. I don't care what your theology is as long as you love Jesus. But I will say I grew out of that because it made me a worse person. It made me less like Jesus because I thought sovereignty meant that a king has to control everything every person does in his kingdom. And finally, some very wise person said to me, is that how good kings would do it? If a real good king had real power over his kingdom, would he have to control every detail of every citizen? Or could he sit in his palace relaxed and love the people of his kingdom and let them do as they please and simply step in as needed whenever he feels like it? Which one really has control? And I thought long and hard about that, and I realized how broken my theology was. I thought God was a king because he was in control of every little thing. It's quite the opposite. If God is really in control, he doesn't have to control every little thing. He's God. He can step in whenever he wants. A true sovereign doesn't operate out of fear and insecurity, having to micromanage. A true sovereign can sit securely on his throne, trusting that in the end his will come to pass. That's God. He is truly the king, and he's a good king. Philippians talks about the kind of king that Jesus is. Paul says, though he was in the form of God, Jesus didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped. That's a powerful word, to grab onto. But he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. God doesn't rule through domination. Origen, one of the great leaders in the early church, said God's power is not the power of coercion, but the power of love. So I'm going to ask you again what I asked you at the beginning. In your life, in your relationships, do you operate out of self-giving love, or do you tend to operate out of self-preservation and control? Do you try to manipulate people to get situations the way you think they ought to be in your life, or do you simply live and let live and give of yourself freely? One of those comes much easier to me than the other, but it's not the right one, and I have to work on it. All of this comes to a head at the Last Supper. In John 13, Jesus, knowing that he has all authority, again, knowing that he is truly the sovereign, that he's the king, he does something remarkable. He kneels and he washes the disciples' feet. It's not a story we often connect to Christmas and the manger, but it ought to be because it's the conclusion to that narrative. As he's wrapping up his earthly ministry, the reason he comes into the world, he decides that this is how it should come to an end. He washes their feet, and then he eats dinner with them. Think about that. The King of the universe has gone from the manger through crowds of poor and needy people, faithless people, ungrateful people. He's healed them, he's blessed them, and later they would revile him and crucify him. And now he's down on his knees, washing dirt off of the feet of traitorous friends, some of whom had already betrayed him, some who would abandon him. Half-hearted friends. And the king is on his knees washing their feet. That's what a good king looks like. Herod never did that. Caesar never did that. Jesus is different. Then he breaks the bread and he lifts the cup and he says, "This is my body and this is my blood, and I'm giving it for you." Why? Because I'm afraid for you. I'm worried about what will happen to you if I don't come and help. And so I've come to help. And I want you to have that same fear for me and for others, that you are worried about ever letting this relationship be pulled apart or ever failing to love the people around you as you should. That healthy sort of fear that leads Jesus to the cross. Loyalty, not demanded through fear of punishment, but loyalty that almost automatically develops because of faithful love. It's the best kind of loyalty, and it belongs to the greatest sort of king. I think about the story a lot, the story of the passion of Jesus, not just because I'm a pastor, but as a Christian. I can't help but think about it, what it means for me, what it means for my life. If I'm to model myself after Jesus, then I have to consider, who is Jesus and what did he do? How should I live? What should I do? Jesus, the strongest man the world has ever known, the greatest king of all time, with the largest kingdom the universe could contain. And where do we find him? This week in a manger, amidst animals, surrounded by poor shepherds in a forgotten village. Defenseless, a little baby. And then we keep finding him in these strange places. Later, he's an ill-respected itinerant rabbi who has no place to call home. Later, he's a beaten and bloodied mess, being mocked by crowds of his own people as he's dragged through the streets of his own holy city. And then finally, we find him abandoned by his friends, tortured, publicly executed by the state, and laid to rest in a cold tomb. And this is the picture of power and kingship. Perhaps we've misunderstood what kingship really is. Is it possible that we don't really even understand what power looks like in practice? Because we are guided by fear instead of love. What makes a leader truly powerful? What makes a leader truly great? If it's not militant force, if it's not diplomatic wisdom and the size of their kingdom, it must be something else. And I'm afraid we all know the answer. We're just afraid to say it out loud because it seems so simple and it's so scary that it's so simple. But you know the answer, don't you? You know what makes Jesus the very best king. It's love. It's always been love. it will always be love. Because God is love. And perfect love drives out fear. Jesus' love witnessed as compassion and grace and kindness and mercy. Gentle love, affectionate love, self-sacrificing love. To the Jews, a stumbling block. To the nations of this world, foolishness. But to you, to me, to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Love. Surely there's nothing better to celebrate for Christmas than the love of God. So I want to go back and think about the north wind and the sun. Would you stand with me as we close? In the fable, the traveler's heart is moved not by the force of the cold wind that only makes him tighten his cloak, which is the irony of kings who rule by force and domination. They are not loved, they are obeyed, but they are not loved. Often they are the most hated. Instead, the sun, through gentle warmth, allows the traveler to loosen and eventually take off his cloak. He achieves the goal, but not through force, not through domination or coercion, but through gentle warmth, through love, through compassion. We function the same way when we celebrate the birth of Jesus. We have to remember he doesn't prove his kingship by forcing us to bow our knee. I think every knee will bow by choice. I don't know how God will accomplish this, but I think when people understand who God really is, because right now I don't think any of us quite get it, but when they do, how could they not? How could anyone not bow to a king like Jesus when they understand the depth of his love and his compassion? That's why you're here today, because you can't help but worship God. Not because you're afraid of him. He's not this angry potter who just breaks stuff. He's a good potter who won't let anything remain wasted, but will remake it and reform it again and again until it is perfect. That's his goal for you, because he loves you, because he's a good king, a good father, a good spouse, a good friend. He's everything good that there is, and he's all those things for you. This Christmas, I want us to reflect on God's love in our relationships, in our homes, our workplaces, everywhere we go. Consider what it looks like to love with gentleness and compassion, to give of ourselves instead of trying to take and force and control. Do this out of reverence for our King, who showed us the better way.